In the shadow of Montana's Rocky Mountains, where autumn winds carried the scent of pine and coming snow, a wealthy rancher named Robert Thornton stood before a crowd and made a declaration that would echo through the Flathead Valley for years to come. His prized gray stallion, Thunder, had thrown every rider who dared mount him. Professional bronc busters, championship ropers, even Olympic equestrians had left his ranch bruised and humbled. Thornton's challenge was simple and brutal. Ride Thunder for 90 seconds, and walk away with $50,000 and your choice of any horse on his estate. But as the failures mounted and the legend grew, no one expected that the answer would come not from another expert, but from a quiet farmer who arrived carrying nothing but a wooden flute and a patience the world had forgotten. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Flathead Valley stretched wide and wild beneath a September sky so blue it hurt to look at too long. Morning light poured over the Rockies in sheets of gold, illuminating the ponderosa pines that climbed the foothills like dark sentinels guarding secrets older than memory. The air tasted clean and sharp, carrying with it the mineral tang of glacier melt from Cottonwood Creek and the sweet earthiness of sage crushed underfoot. This was Montana at its finest. A place where the land still remembered what it meant to be untamed, where eagles carved lazy circles overhead and the mountains rose with an indifference that made human ambition seem small and brief as a mayfly's dance. Robert Thornton's estate occupied the choicest parcel of this paradise. 300 acres of rolling pasture bordered by split-rail fencing that had been oiled and maintained with the kind of obsessive care that spoke of deep pockets and deeper pride. The main house was built from local stone and timber, a sprawling structure with a wraparound porch that commanded views of the entire valley. Copper gutters gleamed in the sunlight, and the weather vane atop the red barn spun lazily in the morning breeze, its rooster silhouette catching fire when the sun hit it just right. Everything about the Thornton place whispered of success, of a man who had carved his empire from nothing and meant for everyone to see the proof. Robert himself stood at the corral fence, one boot propped on the lowest rail, his arms draped over the top beam with the casual authority of someone who owned not just the land but the very air above it. At 58, he still carried himself like the college linebacker he'd been decades ago, broad through the shoulders and thick through the chest, though the years had added a paunch around his middle that expensive shirts could only partially disguise. His face was weathered and ruddy, carved into permanent lines of determination by decades of deal-making and deal-breaking in the cutthroat world of commercial real estate. His hair, once black as a raven's wing, had gone silver at the temples, which he liked to think gave him a distinguished air. His eyes, pale gray like winter ice, swept across the assembled crowd with the practiced assessment of a man who measured everything in terms of value and leverage. The crowd itself numbered close to 200, maybe more, a mix of locals and curiosity seekers drawn by word of mouth and social media posts that had spread through the valley like wildfire. Pickup trucks lined the gravel drive, their beds loaded with coolers and folding chairs. Families had made a day of it, spreading blankets on the grass while children chased each other around the fence posts, their laughter cutting through the adult conversation like birdsong. The smell of grilled meat drifted from a food truck someone had enterprisingly positioned near the main gate, and the whole scene had taken on the festive air of a county fair, though the undercurrent of tension suggested something darker, something closer to the Roman crowds who had once gathered to watch men fight lions for sport. At the center of all this attention, inside the corral, stood Thunder. The stallion was a study in barely contained violence, a gray Andalusian whose coat shimmered like liquid mercury in the morning light. He stood 17 hands high, taller than any horse Robert had owned in 40 years of breeding and buying, with a chest like a barrel and legs thick as fence posts. His mane and tail were almost pure white, flowing like silk when he moved, which he did constantly, pacing the perimeter of the corral with the restless energy of a storm trapped in a bottle. His eyes were dark and intelligent, too intelligent, Robert sometimes thought late at night when the whiskey loosened his more philosophical considerations. Those eyes tracked every movement outside the fence, cataloging threats and calculating distances with the cold precision of a predator. Robert had purchased Thunder 18 months ago at an estate sale in Wyoming, where the previous owner had practically begged someone to take the animal off his hands. The man had been near tears, nursing a broken collarbone and a shattered reputation, explaining that the horse had been wild-caught in Nevada, part of a Mustang herd that had roamed free for generations before the Bureau of Land Management rounded them up. Thunder had been gelded, trained, or so they claimed, but something in him had never accepted domestication. He had sent 3 professional trainers to the hospital and put a 4th in a wheelchair for 6 months. The man selling him called Thunder a demon. Robert called him an opportunity, because Robert Thornton had built his fortune on a simple principle that had served him well since he was a young man scrapping his way through business school on scholarships and spite. Everything could be broken if you applied enough pressure in the right places. Buildings, deals, competitors, and yes, horses. He had purchased Thunder not despite his reputation but because of it. In Robert's mind, taming the untamable stallion would be the perfect metaphor for his life. A final capstone on a career spent bending the world to his vision. He would succeed where others had failed, and in doing so, he would cement his legacy as a man who conquered everything he touched. The wager had been his idea, born one night over bourbon with Deputy Marshal Kevin Hayes, an old friend who had watched Robert's empire grow from a single rental property to a real estate portfolio that stretched across 3 states. Kevin had been warning him, gently as always, that Thunder was different, that some creatures were meant to run free, that forcing the issue might end in tragedy. Robert had laughed, that booming sound that had intimidated boardrooms full of lawyers, and slapped the table hard enough to make the glasses jump. $50,000 to anyone who could ride Thunder for 90 seconds. He had shouted it loud enough for half the bar to hear, and by morning, the whole valley knew. That had been 3 weeks ago. In the time since, Robert had watched a parade of confident men and a few fearless women climb into his corral, each certain they would be the one to crack the code, to find the trick that would turn Thunder from wild beast into docile mount. A championship bull rider from Billings had lasted maybe 5 seconds before Thunder's violent spin sent him cartwheeling through the air like a rag doll. A horse whisperer from California, a woman with gentle hands and softer words, had barely gotten within touching distance before Thunder charged, forcing her to vault the fence with a speed that suggested divine intervention. A retired Marine who had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan and claimed he feared nothing had climbed down from Thunder's back under his own power but left the ranch white-faced and shaking, muttering that he had looked into the horse's eyes and seen his own death looking back. Each failure delighted Robert in ways he would not have admitted even to himself. Oh, he maintained the proper concerned expression, calling out warnings and offering medical attention. But beneath the surface, he felt a swelling satisfaction. Every defeat proved him right. The world was divided into those who could and those who could not, and Robert Thornton had always been one of those who could. That Thunder remained unridden was not a failure of his plan but a validation of his judgment in choosing an opponent worthy of his eventual triumph. His son James watched from the porch, leaning against a post with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral. At 28, Jamie had inherited his father's build but his mother's temperament, which was to say he possessed the strength to break things but the wisdom to question whether breaking them was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's necessary. He had come back to Montana after college with a degree in environmental science and ideas about sustainable ranching that Robert dismissed as coastal liberal nonsense, though he kept his criticisms gentle because Jamie was all he had left since Ellen died. The boy meant well, Robert told himself. He just needed more time to understand how the world really worked. Jamie had been arguing against the wager from the beginning, pointing out that Thunder's value lay not in being broken but in his spirit, that a stallion like that could command stud fees in the tens of thousands if allowed to remain wild and free. Robert had waved away such talk. Money was not the point. Legacy was the point. And legacy demanded that Thunder be ridden, that the horse's wildness be channeled and controlled and made to serve human purpose. That was the natural order. That was progress. Deputy Marshal Kevin Hayes stood nearby, his uniform crisp despite the morning heat beginning to build as the sun climbed higher. Kevin was a year older than Robert, though he looked younger, his face unlined and peaceful in the way of men who had found contentment in modest ambition. They had grown up together, played football together, even dated the same girl once, though that was ancient history better left unexamined. Kevin had become a lawman, Robert a mogul, but they had maintained their friendship across the years, even as their paths diverged. Kevin was one of the few people who could speak bluntly to Robert without risking offense, a privilege he exercised now as another rider prepared to enter the corral. "You are building something you cannot control," Kevin said quietly. His voice carried that particular authority that came with a badge and a lifetime of seeing how pride destroys good men. "This is not about the horse anymore. Look at these people. You have turned this into a circus, and circuses always end with someone getting hurt." Robert grinned without warmth. "You worry too much, Kev. Everyone here signed waivers. Everyone knows the risks. This is entertainment. This is capitalism in its purest form. A challenge, a reward, and may the best man win." Kevin shook his head but said nothing more. He had learned decades ago that Robert Thornton, once his mind was set, could not be budged by reason or friendship or common sense. The man was a force of nature, and forces of nature did not negotiate. The morning's first challenger was already in the corral, a young ranch hand named Brady Mitchell who had been talking big for days about how his grandfather had been a legendary bronc rider and how the skill ran in his blood. Brady was 22 and built like a whip, all lean muscle and coiled energy. He wore a black Stetson that had cost more than his truck and boots with pointed toes polished to a high shine. His swagger was the kind that comes from never having been truly tested, from living a life where confidence and competence had not yet been forced to reconcile their differences. Thunder watched him approach with ears pinned flat and nostrils flaring. The stallion's body language screamed danger to anyone with eyes to see, but Brady either could not read the signs or chose to ignore them. He moved in fast, trying to use speed to overcome Thunder's wariness, reaching for the makeshift hackamore that hung loose around the stallion's neck. It was a mistake. Thunder exploded sideways with a violence that sent dirt and gravel flying. His shoulder caught Brady square in the chest, and the young man went down hard, the air leaving his lungs in a whoosh that was audible even over the crowd's collective gasp. Thunder reared, hooves flashing in the sunlight, and for a terrible moment it seemed he would bring them down on the prone figure beneath him. But the stallion wheeled at the last second, galloping to the far end of the corral where he stood snorting and stamping, his message clear. "Do not touch me." Brady crawled to the fence and hauled himself over, his face red with embarrassment and lack of oxygen. The crowd offered sympathetic applause, the kind reserved for noble failures, and someone handed him a bottle of water. Robert called out words of encouragement, but his eyes had already moved past Brady, scanning the crowd for the next challenger, the next opportunity to prove his point. The day wore on. The sun climbed higher, turning the valley into a furnace of light and heat. 3 more riders tried and failed. A woman from Kalispell who trained horses for movies lasted longer than most, almost 20 seconds, before Thunder's violent bucking sent her sailing over his head to land in an undignified heap. She limped away with her pride intact but her confidence shaken, muttering that the horse was not wild but cursed. An old cowboy with a face like cracked leather and hands scarred from a lifetime of rope work managed to get a hand on Thunder's mane before the stallion bit him hard enough to draw blood. The cowboy laughed it off, wrapping his hand in a bandana and declaring that in his youth he had ridden meaner, though his eyes told a different story. By noon, the crowd had swelled to nearly 300. Word had spread to neighboring valleys, and people kept arriving, drawn by that peculiar human magnetism that attends disasters and spectacles. Food trucks multiplied. Someone set up a betting pool. Children grew bored with watching and turned to other games. But the adults remained transfixed, their eyes locked on Thunder, on Robert, on the drama unfolding in the dust and sunlight. Robert felt his chest expand with something close to joy. This was what he had wanted. This was proof that he still mattered, that Robert Thornton could command attention and respect, that his name still carried weight. The real estate empire was solid but abstract, numbers on spreadsheets and properties scattered across time zones. This was immediate and real. This was a story that would be told and retold, growing in the telling until it became legend. And when he finally rode Thunder, when he succeeded where all others had failed, the legend would be complete. Jamie appeared at his elbow, his voice low and urgent. "Dad, this has gone far enough. Look at Thunder. He is exhausted. He is dehydrated. This is cruelty disguised as entertainment. Robert did not look at his son. The horse is fine. He has water. He has shade. He is just stubborn. Like his owner. The joke fell flat. You are being stubborn, Jamie pressed. This is not about the horse anymore. This is about your ego. You made a bet you cannot win, and now you are letting it escalate rather than admit you were wrong. The words hit harder than Jamie likely intended. Robert's jaw tightened, and when he finally turned to look at his son, his eyes had gone cold. I am never wrong, he said quietly. I simply have not found the right approach yet. And when I do, you will see. Everyone will see. Jamie opened his mouth to argue further but closed it again, recognizing the futility. He had seen that expression before, usually right before his father closed a deal that everyone said was impossible or pushed through a development that all the experts claimed could not be done. Robert Thornton did not fail. He simply refused to accept failure as a possibility until reality bent to match his vision. The afternoon stretched long and hot. Thunder paced his corral, his gray coat dark with sweat, his breathing heavy but steady. He had stopped charging at the fence, conserved his energy, but his eyes never stopped moving, never stopped watching. More challengers came. More challengers failed. A pattern emerged that even the most optimistic observers could not deny. Thunder was not being difficult. Thunder was being impossible. As the sun began its slow descent toward the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real, a battered pickup truck rattled up the long drive to the Thornton estate. It was an old Ford, maybe 20 years past its prime, with rust eating at the wheel wells and a tailgate held shut with baling wire. The truck moved slowly, almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to be among the newer vehicles crowding the property. It parked at the very edge of the lot, far from the main gathering, and the engine ticked and pinged as it cooled in the evening air. The driver's door opened with a creak that spoke of hinges long past their prime, and a man stepped out. He was neither young nor old, somewhere in that middle country where age becomes less about years and more about experience. His face was weathered but kind, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often and deeply. He wore work clothes, faded jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. His hair was brown going gray, worn a bit longer than fashion dictated, curling slightly at the collar. He moved with an easy grace that suggested comfort in his own skin, a man who had nothing to prove and no one to impress. From a canvas bag in the truck bed, he withdrew a wooden flute, simple and unadorned, the kind of instrument that looked like it had been carved by hand during long winter evenings. He tucked it into his belt and began walking toward the crowd, his stride unhurried, his gaze taking in the scene with the quiet assessment of someone who sees more than surfaces. His name was Eli Brooks, and he was about to change everything. The crowd parted slowly as Eli Brooks made his way toward the corral, not out of recognition but simple courtesy, the automatic making of space that happens when someone moves with quiet purpose through a gathering. He went unnoticed at first, just another face in a sea of spectators who had come to witness Robert Thornton's grand spectacle. The air had cooled slightly with the sun's descent, but the ground still radiated the day's accumulated heat, and the smell of dust and horses and grilled food hung thick enough to taste. Eli stopped at the fence line, his fingers curling around the weathered wood as he studied Thunder. The stallion stood at the far end of the corral, his magnificent gray coat streaked with the salt of dried sweat, his sides heaving from hours of defending his space against unwanted human attention. Even exhausted, Thunder carried himself with a dignity that bordered on defiance, his head high, his dark eyes watching the gathered humans with an expression that might have been contempt if horses were capable of such refined disdain. What struck Eli most was not the horse's size or beauty, though both were considerable, but the air of profound loneliness that emanated from the animal. Thunder stood isolated in a crowd, separated not by the fence but by something deeper, a chasm of misunderstanding that had grown with each failed attempt to dominate him. Eli had seen that look before in wild animals caged at roadside zoos, in shelter dogs who had given up hope of kindness, in his own reflection during the darkest period of his life when he had been a veterinarian burning out under the weight of trying to fix every broken creature while ignoring his own brokenness. He had been 34 when the career he had built with such care and sacrifice had crumbled. Eli had graduated top of his class from veterinary school, driven by a genuine love of animals and a belief that science and compassion could heal almost anything. He had opened his own practice in a small town outside of Missoula, working 18-hour days, taking emergency calls at 3 in the morning, extending credit to families who could not afford to pay because he could not bear to turn away a suffering animal. For 8 years he had poured everything into that practice, his time, his money, his health, his marriage. And then one morning he had walked into his clinic and found he could not remember why any of it mattered. The burnout had not come as a dramatic collapse but as a slow dimming, like a light bulb losing its filament wire by wire until one day you realize you are standing in darkness. He began making mistakes, small ones at first, a decimal point in the wrong place on a medication dosage, a missed diagnosis that became obvious only in hindsight, then larger mistakes, the kind that cost animals their lives and haunted his sleep. His wife left, not cruelly but sadly, explaining that she felt like she was living with a ghost. His partners at the practice suggested he take time off, which was professional courtesy for asking him to leave before he destroyed what they had all built together. Eli had sold his share of the practice and retreated to a 20-acre parcel outside of Whitefish that his grandfather had left him, land that had been in the family for 3 generations but had sat mostly unused since his grandfather's death. The farmhouse was small and needed work, the barn was sound but empty, and the fields had gone to weeds and wildflowers. It was perfect. He spent 6 months doing almost nothing, sleeping late, sitting on the porch, watching the seasons change with the kind of attention he had forgotten was possible when your days were measured in appointments and emergencies. The healing had begun with silence. Eli learned to sit still, to listen to wind in the pines and water in the creek, to the sound of his own breathing without the constant mental chatter of diagnosis and treatment plans. He started a small vegetable garden, discovering that growing things required a patience he had never developed in his surgical training. Plants did not respond to force or urgency. They grew according to their own timeline, and all the human anxiety in the world could not make a tomato ripen faster. It was during this period that he met Joseph Redfeather, a Salish elder who lived on the Flathead Reservation and occasionally came to the farmer's market in Whitefish. Joseph was in his 70s, with braided gray hair and hands gnarled by arthritis but still capable of remarkable craftsmanship. He carved flutes from willow and cedar, traditional instruments whose music seemed to carry something older than melody, something that spoke to parts of human consciousness that predated language. Eli had been drawn to Joseph's booth not by the flutes but by the man himself, who radiated a quality of peaceful attention that Eli recognized as what he was searching for. They had struck up a conversation that stretched over weeks and months, meeting for coffee, taking walks along the river, talking about everything and nothing. Joseph never asked about Eli's past or pushed for explanations. He simply offered friendship and, eventually, teaching. The flute Eli now carried at his belt was one he had carved himself under Joseph's patient instruction. It had taken him 3 months to complete, working in the evenings after his farm chores, learning to read the grain of the wood and follow its natural inclinations rather than imposing his will upon it. The flute was far from perfect, its tone wavering and uncertain compared to Joseph's masterworks, but it was his, and more importantly, the process of making it had taught him something essential about patience and respect, about working with the nature of things rather than against it. Joseph had taught him to play not through formal lessons but through presence, sitting together in comfortable silence, letting music emerge naturally rather than forcing it through technique and practice. The old man explained that the flute was a tool for listening, not for speaking, that its purpose was to create space where understanding could grow. Eli had not fully grasped what Joseph meant until one evening when he was playing alone by the creek and a deer had approached, drawn by the sound, coming close enough that he could see his reflection in its dark eyes. The deer had stayed for perhaps 5 minutes, and in that time, Eli felt a connection he had lost somewhere in his years of clinical veterinary practice, a recognition that animals were not simply bodies to be fixed but beings to be known. Now, standing at Robert Thornton's fence, watching thunder pace his prison, Eli felt that same recognition stirring in his chest. This was not a problem to be solved through dominance or technique. This was a relationship that had been broken before it began, and healing it would require something the assembled crowd had not yet offered: time, patience, and a willingness to be changed by the encounter rather than demanding change from the other. Robert Thornton had noticed Eli now, his gray eyes narrowing as he assessed this new arrival. Robert had developed an instinct for reading people during his years in real estate, a skill for sorting potential buyers from time wasters, serious investors from dreamers. This man with his worn clothes and homemade flute did not register as serious. He looked like someone who had wandered in from a folk music festival, earnest but ineffectual, the kind of person who had opinions about chakras and healing crystals and other nonsense that Robert dismissed as intellectual laziness disguised as spirituality. Still, the crowd had thinned as evening approached, and Robert was not yet ready for his spectacle to end. He made his way over to where Eli stood, his approach casual but commanding, the walk of a man accustomed to owning every space he entered. Deputy Marshal Kevin Hayes followed, his expression thoughtful, and Jamie Thornton drifted over as well, curiosity drawing him toward this stranger who studied thunder with such focused attention. Robert leaned against the fence beside Eli, deliberately casual, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby spectators. "You thinking about trying your luck? The challenge is still open. $50,000 to anyone who can ride thunder for 90 seconds. Plus your choice of any other horse on my property. That is $250,000 worth of horses to choose from." Eli did not look at Robert immediately. He kept his eyes on thunder, watching the way the stallion's ears flickered at sounds, the tension in his muscles, the whites showing around his eyes. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost conversational. "I do not think anyone is going to ride him. Not today. Maybe not ever if you keep approaching him the way you have been." The words hung in the air, and the nearby spectators went quiet, sensing confrontation. Robert's jaw tightened, his smile fixed but his eyes cooling to chips of ice. "Is that so? And what makes you an expert? You are a horse trainer? A professional rider? You have credentials I should know about?" Eli shook his head slowly. "I am a farmer. Before that I was a veterinarian, but I do not practice anymore. I just happened to be in town and heard about what was happening here. Thought I would come see for myself." Robert's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Farmer. That is perfect. So you do not have any relevant experience, but you are going to stand at my fence and tell me I am doing something wrong with my own horse on my own property. Is that about right?" Eli finally turned to look at Robert, and his gaze was steady, neither challenging nor afraid. "I am not telling you anything. I am just observing that thunder is not wild or mean or broken. He is terrified. Every person who has climbed into that corral today has come at him with the energy of conquest, trying to take something from him. He has been defending himself the only way he knows how. If you want a different result, you need a different approach." The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing drama more interesting than another failed riding attempt. Robert felt the attention like a spotlight, and his pride bristled at being corrected by this nobody, this farmer with his homemade flute and his soft words. "You think you can do better? You think you have some magic touch that 24 professional riders do not have? Please, enlighten us. Show us how it is done." Eli glanced at Thunder again, then back at Robert. "I do not want to ride him. I do not need to prove anything. But if you are genuinely interested in helping that horse, in building trust instead of breaking his spirit, I could try talking with him. Not as a challenge. Not for money. Just because he deserves better than what has happened to him today." Kevin Hayes straightened up, his interest genuinely piqued. He had known Robert long enough to see the anger building beneath his friend's controlled exterior, but he had also spent a career learning to read people, and there was something in this farmer's demeanor that rang true. The man was not grandstanding or seeking attention. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone stating simple facts. Kevin found himself wanting to see what would happen if Robert allowed it, though he suspected his friend's pride would not permit such a concession. Jamie Thornton moved closer, his eyes bright with hope. "Dad, let him try. What have you got to lose? Everyone else has failed. If this guy can at least calm Thunder down, is that not worth seeing?" Robert rounded on his son, his voice low but fierce. This is not about calming him down. This is about proving that he can be ridden, that he can be useful. I did not spend $200,000 on a pasture ornament. Thunder is valuable because of his bloodlines, because of his potential as a breeding stallion, but that value is meaningless if no one can handle him. He needs to be broken, trained, made manageable. That is the whole point. Eli spoke again, his tone unchanged. Broken. That is the word everyone keeps using. But what if he does not need to be broken? What if he just needs to be understood? Robert spun back toward Eli, his face flushed with anger now, all pretense of civility abandoned. You do not understand anything. This is my ranch, my horse, my challenge. I have invested time and money and reputation into this. I am not going to let some hippie farmer turn this into a therapy session for a horse. This is about results, about winning, about showing that there is not an animal alive that cannot be brought to heel if you have the will and the resources to do it. The words echoed across the corral, raw and honest in their ruthlessness. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, suddenly seeing something beneath Robert Thornton's genial showmanship, something harder and colder, the engine that had driven him to build his empire. For some watching, it was confirmation of suspicions they had harbored. For others, it was a disillusioning glimpse behind a carefully maintained facade. Jamie looked at his father with an expression somewhere between disappointment and pity. Mom would not have wanted this, he said quietly. She loved horses because they were beautiful and free. She never wanted to see one beaten into submission. Robert flinched as though struck. His late wife Ellen's name was a weapon Jamie rarely deployed, knowing its power. Robert had loved Ellen in his way, as much as a man like him could love anything beyond his own ambition. Her death 3 years earlier from cancer had hollowed him out, though he refused to acknowledge the grief, burying it beneath work and new projects and schemes like this wager. But Jamie was right and Robert knew it. Ellen had been gentle with animals, patient with the horses she rode, content to work within their nature rather than dominating them. She would have hated this spectacle. She would have been ashamed of him. The realization did not soften Robert's anger but redirected it inward, where it curdled into something more toxic. He turned away from his son, from Eli, from all of them, and walked toward the main house without another word. His retreat left a vacuum that the crowd did not know how to fill. Conversations resumed in uncertain murmurs. Some people began packing up, sensing the show was over for the day. Others lingered, curious about this farmer who had managed to rattle Robert Thornton so thoroughly with nothing but quiet observations. Kevin Hayes remained at the fence, studying Eli with open curiosity. You are either very brave or very foolish to talk to Robert like that. He is not a man who takes criticism well, especially in front of an audience. Eli shrugged, his attention already back on Thunder. I was not trying to criticize. I was just being honest. That horse is suffering. Anyone with eyes can see it. I do not care about Robert Thornton's ego or his reputation. I care about that animal standing in the heat and dust, alone and afraid, being treated like a problem to solve instead of a living being worthy of respect. Kevin found himself smiling despite the tension. You might be the first person in 20 years to tell Robert Thornton he is wrong about something and live to tell the tale. I am Deputy Marshal Kevin Hayes. I have known Robert since we were kids. He is a good man underneath all the bluster, but he has forgotten how to lose, and that makes him dangerous. Eli extended his hand and they shook. Eli Brooks. I have a small farm about 10 miles north of here. Vegetables mostly, some chickens. Nothing fancy. And I am not interested in making an enemy of your friend. I just could not watch what was happening without saying something. Jamie approached them, his face troubled. Thank you for speaking up. I have been trying to tell my father the same things for weeks, but he does not hear me. Maybe coming from a stranger, it will sink in eventually. His name is Jamie Thornton, by the way. Robert's son, though right now I am not particularly proud of that association. Eli nodded in acknowledgement. Your father is in pain. Grief has a way of twisting people, making them hard and brittle. He is trying to prove something, but I do not think he knows what it is anymore. The horse is just a symbol for whatever he cannot say out loud. Jamie blinked, surprised by the insight. You got all that from a 5-minute conversation? Eli smiled faintly. I spent a long time learning to pay attention. It is the only skill that really matters, and it is the one most people never develop because they are too busy talking or planning or trying to control outcomes. Your father is drowning in his need to control things, and thunder represents the one thing he cannot bend to his will. That is why he is so fixated on breaking him. It is not really about the horse at all. The three men stood in companionable silence as the evening deepened into twilight. The crowd had thinned to perhaps 50 people, the diehards who wanted to see if anything else would happen before darkness made further attempts impossible. Thunder had stopped his pacing and now stood motionless, his head lowered, exhaustion finally overwhelming his adrenaline. Even from a distance, Eli could see the tremor in the stallion's legs, the way his breathing came shallow and quick. Without planning it, without asking permission, Eli climbed the fence and dropped into the corral. The movement was so casual and unexpected that no one reacted at first. Kevin Hayes opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Jamie caught his arm, his grip tight. Wait, just wait and see what happens. Thunder's head came up instantly, ears pinned flat, eyes rolling to find the source of this new intrusion. Eli did not approach. He simply stood where he had landed, perhaps 30 feet from the stallion, his body relaxed, his hands visible and empty except for the wooden flute tucked into his belt. He did not stare directly at Thunder but kept the horse in his peripheral vision, respecting the animal's space and autonomy. Minutes passed. The crowd held its collective breath. Thunder snorted once, a sharp exhalation that sent dust puffing from his nostrils. He took a step sideways, testing, waiting for Eli to advance, to reach for a rope, to do any of the threatening things every other human had done. But Eli remained still, patient, his breathing slow and deep. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, Eli withdrew the wooden flute from his belt. He did not raise it to his lips immediately. He simply held it, letting Thunder see it, letting the stallion understand that this strange human had brought something different into his space. When Eli finally began to play, the notes that emerged were soft and uncertain. A simple melody that seemed to float on the cooling air like smoke from a distant fire. Thunder's ears flickered forward, no longer pinned in anger but pricked in curiosity. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced, neither threatening nor demanding, simply present. Eli played for perhaps a minute, then lowered the flute and stood in silence. Thunder watched him, motionless except for the rise and fall of his breathing. The stallion took one step closer, then stopped. Another step, another. He was not approaching to attack but to investigate, drawn by this human who offered music instead of mastery. From outside the corral, Jamie felt tears prick his eyes. He did not know why, could not have articulated what moved him so deeply, but watching this stranger and his father's impossible horse begin the tentative dance of understanding felt like witnessing something sacred, a small miracle unfolding in the dust and fading light. Kevin Hayes stood with his arms crossed, his professional skepticism warring with the evidence of his eyes. Thunder had not come this close to any human today without violence preceding or following the contact. Eli played again, another verse of the simple melody, and Thunder continued his slow approach until he stood perhaps 10 feet away, close enough that Eli could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, the network of scars on his shoulders and flanks from previous battles with fences and humans. The stallion's dark eyes studied him with an intelligence that was unmistakable, assessing not just threat but intention, trying to understand what this human wanted. Eli lowered the flute again and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I am not here to hurt you. I am not here to take anything from you. I just wanted you to know that not all humans are the same. Some of us remember how to listen. Thunder's response was to take one more step, close enough now that Eli could have reached out and touched him. But Eli did not reach. He simply stood, present and patient, offering nothing but his quiet company. The stallion lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he drew in Eli's scent, reading the story written in pheromones and sweat. Whatever Thunder found there seemed to satisfy some requirement. because the tension finally began draining from his massive frame. His eyes half closed, the whites no longer showing, and for the first time all day, he looked less like a creature at war and more like a tired animal who wanted rest. The moment stretched and held. Then, as twilight deepened toward true darkness, Eli took a slow step backward, honoring the contact but not pushing it further. Thunder watched him retreat, made no move to follow, but neither did he return to his defensive posture. When Eli reached the fence and climbed back over, the stallion simply stood in the center of the corral, his head still lowered, his breathing slow and steady. The remaining spectators erupted in confused applause, uncertain what they had witnessed but sensing it was significant. Jamie was grinning like a child on Christmas morning. Kevin Hayes shook his head in wonder. Even the handful of riders who had been thrown earlier in the day came forward to congratulate Eli, asking how he had done it, what was his secret, could he teach them. Eli deflected the questions with gentle humor. There is no secret. There is just patience and respect. Thunder needed to know he had a choice, that he could say no and be heard. Everything else followed from that. As the crowd finally dispersed and vehicles began rolling down the long drive away from the Thornton estate, Robert emerged from his house and stood on the porch, watching. He had seen what happened through the window, had witnessed his impossible horse respond to the farmer's music and patience in ways he had never responded to force and dominance. The sight filled Robert with a complex stew of emotions he could not name. Anger, yes, at being shown up on his own property. But also something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame, and beneath that, the faintest stirring of curiosity. He did not call out to Eli as the farmer walked toward his truck. He simply watched, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But tonight, as darkness settled over the Flathead Valley and the first stars emerged above the mountain peaks, Robert Thornton stood alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable knowledge that everything he believed about strength and control might be built on foundations less solid than he had imagined. Dawn arrived cold and brilliant over the Flathead Valley, the kind of morning where frost painted delicate patterns on grass blades and breath emerged in visible clouds. The Rockies stood sharp against a sky scrubbed clean by overnight winds, their peaks catching the first light and glowing like embers. Robert Thornton had not slept well. He had lain awake for hours, replaying yesterday's events, feeling the sting of public embarrassment warring with something more complicated. A grudging curiosity about the farmer who had accomplished in minutes what 24 professionals had failed to achieve in weeks. By the time the sun cleared the mountains, Robert was already dressed and standing on his porch with coffee steaming in his hands. The estate was quiet, the circus atmosphere of yesterday replaced by an almost mournful stillness. The corral stood empty, Thunder having been moved to a larger pasture overnight by Dale Cooper, the foreman who had suggested the stallion needed space to decompress after the day's stress. Robert had agreed without argument, too mentally exhausted to resist. He heard the crunch of gravel before he saw the truck. The same battered Ford from yesterday rolled up the drive, moving slowly as if apologizing for its presence. Robert felt his jaw tighten reflexively, old defensive patterns engaging before his conscious mind could intervene. The truck parked near the barn, and Eli Brooks climbed out, carrying what looked like a thermos and a canvas bag. He spotted Robert on the porch and raised one hand in a casual greeting, then began walking toward the house with that same unhurried gait that suggested he had nowhere more important to be. Robert watched him come, fighting the impulse to retreat inside, to avoid this conversation that felt inevitable and unwelcome in equal measure. Pride told him to send this man away, to reassert control over his property and his narrative. But something else, call it curiosity or exhaustion or the memory of his late wife's voice asking him to be better than his worst instincts, kept him rooted in place. Eli stopped at the base of the porch steps, his head tilted back to meet Robert's eyes. "Morning. I brought coffee if you want some. Figured we might talk if you are willing." Robert's first instinct was to say no, to inform this presumptuous farmer that he did not take kindly to uninvited guests at dawn. But the words stuck in his throat, and what emerged instead was a gruff question. "What is there to talk about? You made your point yesterday. Thunder responded to your flute music and your gentle approach. Congratulations. That does not change the fact that he still cannot be ridden, which means he is still useless as anything but an expensive lawn ornament. Eli absorbed this without reaction, then unscrewed his thermos and poured coffee into the lid, which doubled as a cup. He took a sip, savoring it before responding. Useless is an interesting word. Implies that a living creature's value is determined entirely by what it can do for you. I have been thinking about that a lot since yesterday. About why you need thunder to be ridden so badly that you turned it into a public challenge. About what it costs you to admit that some things cannot be controlled. The observation landed like a punch, accurate enough to hurt. Robert descended the steps slowly, his own coffee forgotten on the porch railing. He stopped a few feet from Eli, close enough to be confrontational but not quite crossing into aggression. You do not know anything about me or my life. You show up here with your homemade flute and your farm wisdom and your judgment, acting like you have it all figured out. But you are just another person telling me I am doing it wrong without offering any actual solutions. Eli nodded as if this was a fair criticism. You are right. I do not know you, but I know pain when I see it, and I know what it looks like when someone is trying to solve an internal problem by dominating an external one. I did the same thing for years, worked myself into the ground trying to save every animal that came through my clinic because if I could just fix enough broken things, maybe I would not have to face the fact that I was broken too. It does not work. It never works. The words cut through Robert's defenses with surgical precision. He opened his mouth to deliver a cutting response, then closed it again. Something in Eli's tone, the absence of judgment or superiority, disarmed him. This was not a lecture. It was testimony from someone who had traveled a similar road and found it led nowhere good. Robert looked away, toward the mountains, buying time to gather his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its sharp edge. My wife died 3 years ago. Cancer. We had 40 years together, and then one day she was gone, and I did not know what to do with all the plans we had made. The trips we were going to take. The grandchildren we were going to spoil. All of it just evaporated, and I was left standing in a big empty house full of her things, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. Eli listened without interrupting, his attention complete and patient. Robert continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had cracked. I threw myself into work because that was the only thing that made sense. Close more deals, build more properties, make more money. But money does not fill the empty spaces. It just piles up and reminds you that you are accumulating things instead of living. So when I saw Thunder at that sale, this magnificent impossible horse that everyone said could not be tamed, I thought maybe that was the answer. If I could break him, train him, make him into something valuable and controlled, then maybe I could prove that I still had purpose. That I was still the man I used to be. The confession hung between them in the cold morning air. Robert felt exposed in a way he had not since Ellen's funeral, when he had stood before a church full of mourners and realized he could not cry because to cry would be to admit the loss was real. Eli set his coffee cup down on the porch step and regarded Robert with something that might have been compassion. Thunder is not your wife, and he is not your grief. He is just a horse who wants to be allowed to exist without constantly having to defend himself. The same thing you want, probably. The same thing we all want. Robert barked a laugh that contained no humor. So what am I supposed to do? Just give up on him? Accept that I wasted $200,000 and 3 weeks of my life on a horse that will never be anything but a pretty face in a pasture? Eli picked up his canvas bag and began walking toward the pasture where Thunder had been moved. Robert, after a moment's hesitation, followed. They walked in silence, boots crunching frost-brittle grass, breath misting in the air. The pasture was 5 acres of rolling land bordered by post and rail fencing, with a cluster of old cottonwoods providing shade at the far end. Thunder stood beneath those trees, his gray coat almost luminous in the early light, his head raised and alert at their approach. Eli stopped at the fence and leaned against it, his posture relaxed and non-threatening. You are asking the wrong question. It is not about giving up or pushing forward. It is about changing your relationship to the outcome. Right now, you see Thunder as a problem to solve, an obstacle between you and proof of your worth. But what if he is not an obstacle? What if he is an invitation to learn something you have been avoiding your whole life? Robert joined him at the fence, his arms crossed defensively. And what would that be? That strength is not the same as control. That value is not the same as utility. That some of the most important relationships in life are built not on dominance but on mutual respect. Eli turned to look at Robert directly. Thunder will never submit to you. Not really. You can drug him, hobble him, tie him down, and eventually you might be able to sit on his back without getting thrown. But you will never have his trust, and without that, you will never have a true partnership. Is that what you want? Compliance without connection? Obedience without respect? The questions burrowed under Robert's skin like splinters. He wanted to argue, to defend his position, to explain that in the real world you could not build an empire on mutual respect and good feelings. The real world required tough decisions and firm hands and the willingness to do what needed to be done regardless of how it made you feel. But even as he formed these arguments, he could hear how hollow they sounded. His empire had cost him his health, his relationship with his son, and years of his life he would never get back. What exactly had all that toughness purchased besides a big empty house and a reputation for being someone people respected but did not particularly like? Thunder had begun moving toward them, drawn perhaps by the sound of voices or by some equine curiosity about these two humans who stood so still and calm. He approached with caution, each step measured, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. Eli reached into his canvas bag and withdrew an apple, slightly wrinkled but still firm. He held it up so Thunder could see it, then placed it on the fence post and stepped back, creating space. The stallion stopped about 15 feet away, nostrils flaring as the scent of apple reached him. "That is what offering looks like," Eli said quietly. "You provide something of value, but you do not force acceptance. You give the other being a choice, and then you respect whatever they decide. If Thunder takes the apple, it is a small act of trust. If he does not, that is also valuable information. Either way, you learn something about where the relationship stands." Robert watched, fascinated despite himself, as Thunder took another tentative step forward. The stallion's ears swiveled constantly, monitoring his environment for danger, but his gaze remained fixed on the apple. Another step, another. When he was close enough, Thunder stretched his neck out as far as it would go, lips pulling back to reveal large yellow teeth as he snatched the apple from the fence post. He retreated immediately, crunching the fruit with obvious pleasure, juice running down his chin. Eli smiled. Progress. Yesterday he would not have come within 20 feet of a human. Today he took food from my hand indirectly. Tomorrow maybe he will let me touch him. Or maybe not. The timeline is his to set, not mine. Robert felt something shifting inside him, a loosening of some long-held tension. What you are describing sounds like it would take months, maybe years. I do not have that kind of time. Eli glanced at him. Why not? Where do you have to be that is more important than this? The question stopped Robert cold. Where did he have to be? His calendar was full of meetings and conference calls and property inspections. Yes, but none of it was urgent. None of it required his personal attention in any meaningful way. He had built a machine that ran quite well without him, and the truth was that most of his current business activities were motivated not by necessity but by the need to feel relevant, to have somewhere to go and something to do that gave structure to his days. Without that structure, he would have to face the emptiness that had been growing inside him since Ellen died, and facing that emptiness terrified him more than any business risk ever had. I do not know how to do what you are suggesting, Robert admitted, and the confession felt like defeat and relief in equal measure. I have spent my entire life learning how to win, how to outwork and outsmart and outlast everyone else. I do not know how to just be patient and see what happens. That feels like weakness. Eli turned to face him fully, his expression serious but kind. It is not weakness. It is actually much harder than domination, because it requires you to sit with uncertainty and discomfort without trying to control the outcome. It requires you to value the process more than the result. That goes against everything you have been taught about success, I imagine. But here is the thing. Thunder does not care about your business empire or your reputation or any of the measurements you use to determine your worth. He only cares about whether you are safe to be around. And right now, you are not, because you radiate the energy of someone who wants to take rather than give. Robert absorbed this in silence. In the pasture, Thunder had finished his apple and was now grazing. His body language relaxed in a way it had not been yesterday. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the frost, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a magpie called out its harsh greeting to the day. Robert thought about his son, about the distance that had grown between them since Ellen's death, about Jamie's gentle suggestions that had felt like criticisms because Robert was too defended to hear them as expressions of love. He thought about the long empty evenings in his big stone house, the way he filled the silence with television news and whiskey and anything that would keep him from sitting with his own thoughts. "Teach me," Robert heard himself say, and the words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Eli. "I do not know if I can change at my age. I have been doing things a certain way for a long time. But if there is another approach, something that might actually work with Thunder without breaking him, I am willing to try. I am tired of fighting. I am tired of winning battles that do not matter and losing the things that do." Eli studied him for a long moment, perhaps assessing whether this was genuine or just another manipulation, another way for Robert to get what he wanted through different means. Whatever he saw in Robert's face must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "All right, but you need to understand this is not a quick fix. This is not a technique you can apply like a business strategy. This is about fundamentally changing how you see yourself in relation to Thunder and probably in relation to everything else in your life. It is going to be uncomfortable. You are going to want to quit. You are going to want to go back to the old ways because they are familiar and this is new. Can you commit to staying with it even when it feels pointless?" Robert met his eyes. "I can try. That is all I can promise. But I will try." They shook hands on it, a formal sealing of an informal agreement. Eli pulled out his flute and played a few notes, nothing structured or formal, just sound for its own sake. Thunder's head came up from his grazing, ears pricked toward them, interested but not alarmed. Eli gestured for Robert to sit on the ground near the fence. Robert hesitated, his expensive jeans and his dignity both rebelling at the idea of sitting in dirt and grass, but he lowered himself awkwardly, feeling every year of his age in his protesting joints. "First lesson," Eli said, settling beside him with the ease of someone who spent his life outdoors. "We are going to sit here for an hour and do nothing but observe Thunder. We are not going to try to accomplish anything or make anything happen. We are just going to watch and listen. You are going to notice things you have never noticed before because you have never taken the time to look. And you are going to start learning that your presence alone, without agenda, is worth something." An hour seemed like an eternity to Robert, whose life was measured in 15-minute increments and who considered any meeting longer than 30 minutes to be a waste of time. But he had made a commitment, so he settled in as best he could, his back against a fence post, his legs stretched out in front of him. Eli sat beside him in comfortable silence, occasionally playing soft notes on his flute, otherwise simply present and attentive. The first 10 minutes were torture for Robert. His mind raced with all the things he should be doing, emails he should be answering, calls he should be returning. His body itched and fidgeted, and used to stillness. He checked his watch every 2 minutes, astonished at how slowly time could move when you were not actively fighting against it. But gradually, reluctantly, his awareness began to shift outward. He started noticing details he had missed in all his previous observations of Thunder. The way the stallion favored his left hind leg slightly, suggesting an old injury or ongoing soreness. The pattern of his grazing, how he moved in rough circles, always keeping the humans in his peripheral vision. The moment when a red-tailed hawk flew overhead and Thunder's whole body tensed, ancient prey instincts flaring before settling again as the bird passed without incident. Eli spoke quietly without looking at Robert. "What do you notice?" Robert surprised himself by having an answer. "He is always aware of us. Even when he looks like he is not paying attention, he is tracking our position. And he is nervous about predators from above." That hawk spooked him. Eli nodded. "Good. What else?" "He favors his left hind leg. Something hurts there. Might be old, might be recent. And he grazes in patterns that keep him close to the trees. Cover. Escape route if he needs it." "Excellent observation," You are starting to read him as an individual with a history and preferences, not just as a problem to solve. That is the foundation of everything else. Eli played a few more notes on his flute. Thunder is teaching you his language if you are willing to learn it. Every movement, every choice about where to stand or which direction to face, that is communication. Most people never learn to read it because they are too busy imposing their own agenda. They sat in silence for the remainder of the hour. By the end of it, Robert felt something he had not experienced in years. A quieting of the constant mental chatter that usually drove his days. His breathing had slowed and deepened without his conscious effort. His shoulders, which he carried perpetually hunched against the weight of responsibility and grief, had dropped and relaxed. When Eli finally stood and indicated the session was over, Robert felt both relief and a strange reluctance to return to his normal life. As they walked back toward the house, the sun now fully risen and warming the valley, Robert asked the question that had been forming throughout the hour of observation. Why are you doing this? Helping me, I mean, you do not owe me anything. I was not exactly welcoming when you showed up yesterday. What is in this for you? Eli was quiet for several steps before answering. Honestly, I am doing it for Thunder. He deserves better than to spend his life in fear, and you are his best chance at a different outcome because you own him and what you decide matters. But I am also doing it for you because I see myself in you. The driven, angry, grief-stricken version of myself from 5 years ago who thought the answer to pain was achievement. That if I just worked hard enough and saved enough animals and proved my worth often enough, the emptiness would go away. It does not go away. It just gets bigger until it swallows everything else. Someone helped me find a different path. A Salish elder named Joseph Redfeather who taught me that strength without wisdom is just violence, and success without connection is just accumulation. I am paying forward what he gave me. Robert felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He wanted to say thank you, to express gratitude for this gift he had not known he needed, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, he simply nodded, and Eli seemed to understand. They parted at Eli's truck with an agreement to meet again the next morning at dawn. As Robert watched the battered Ford rattle back down his drive, he felt the first stirrings of something that might have been hope, or might have been terror, or might have been both at once. The realization that change was possible meant admitting that change was necessary, and that admission carried with it the weight of all the years he had spent building a life that no longer fit who he was or who he wanted to be. He climbed the steps to his porch and stood looking out over his estate, seeing it with fresh eyes. The immaculate fences and manicured pastures and expensive horses, all of it suddenly seemed less like achievement and more like elaborate stage dressing for a performance no one was watching. His phone buzzed in his pocket with emails and notifications, the digital tether that kept him connected to his business empire, and for the first time in memory, he ignored it. Let the messages pile up. Let the deals wait. There was work to be done here, the kind of work that could not be delegated or scheduled or measured in quarterly reports. The kind of work that required him to show up with nothing but his presence and his willingness to be changed. Inside the house, he found Jamie in the kitchen making breakfast. His son looked up in surprise, not accustomed to seeing his father awake and present at this hour without being buried in his phone or laptop. They held each other's gaze for a moment, and Robert saw in his son's eyes a question that had been waiting years to be asked. Are you finally ready to stop running? Robert poured himself more coffee and sat at the kitchen table, a piece of furniture he had not used for actual meals since Ellen died, preferring to eat standing at the counter or in his office while working. I do not know, he said honestly, but I am going to try. That farmer, Eli Brooks, he is going to work with me and Thunder. Teach me a different approach. It might not work. I might be too old and too set in my ways. But I am tired of being angry all the time. I am tired of fighting battles I have already won and still feeling like I have lost something essential. Jamie sat down across from him, and in that moment, father and son began the slow, careful work of rebuilding a connection that had frayed under the weight of grief and misunderstanding. Outside, the Montana morning continued its bright unfolding, the mountains standing witness to small human dramas playing out in their shadow, the creek running cold and clear through land that had seen generations come and go, each thinking themselves permanent until the valley proved otherwise. Thunder grazed in his pasture, unaware that he had become the unlikely catalyst for transformation, that his simple refusal to be dominated had cracked open a door through which light was beginning to stream, illuminating corners that had been dark for far too long. The weeks that followed reshaped Robert Thornton in ways he could not have anticipated. Each morning at dawn, Eli Brooks arrived in his weathered Ford, and the two men would walk to Thunder's pasture with thermoses of coffee and the kind of quiet purpose that needs no announcement. They sat together on the cold ground, observing the stallion as he moved through his daily routines, learning to read the subtle language of equine communication that Robert had ignored throughout his decades of horse ownership. Eli taught him that a flicked ear could signal curiosity, that a lowered head indicated relaxation, that the angle of Thunder's body in relation to theirs revealed his comfort level at any given moment. Robert discovered that patience was not passive but intensely active, requiring constant attention and the willingness to set aside his own agenda in favor of Thunder's timeline. There were mornings when the stallion would not approach closer than 50 feet, days when all their careful observation yielded nothing but the knowledge that Thunder needed more space. On those days, Robert felt the old frustration rising in his chest, the voice that insisted this was a waste of time, that results mattered more than process, that real men took action rather than sitting in grass watching animals graze. But Eli's steady presence and gentle reminders helped him breathe through the discomfort, to recognize these reactions as the death throes of old patterns rather than truth. Jamie joined them often, his presence adding a dimension Robert had not expected. His son possessed a natural gentleness with Thunder that Robert envied and admired in equal measure. Jamie could sit motionless for an hour without apparent effort, his face peaceful, his breathing slow and even. When Thunder finally approached close enough to take food directly from Jamie's outstretched hand, Robert felt a complicated surge of emotion. Pride in his son, certainly, but also a sharp awareness of how much he had missed during Jamie's childhood. Too busy building his empire to notice the remarkable young man developing right under his nose. The transformation in Thunder came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The stallion's wild-eyed panic began to soften into watchful caution. He stopped pacing the fence line during their visits, instead grazing calmly while keeping them in his peripheral awareness. His coat, which had been dull and stressed, began to gleam again as the cortisol levels in his system dropped. The limp in his left hind leg improved once Dr. Patricia Owens, the local veterinarian, was allowed to examine him and discovered an abscess that had been causing chronic pain. Thunder accepted her gentle treatment without the sedation everyone assumed would be necessary, standing quiet while she worked because Eli stood at his shoulder, playing soft notes on the wooden flute. Word spread through the Flathead Valley about what was happening at the Thornton estate. The circus atmosphere did not return, but people came in smaller numbers with genuine curiosity rather than spectacle-seeking hunger. Robert found himself giving impromptu talks about what he was learning, sharing insights about patience and respect that felt strange coming from his mouth but also deeply true. Dale Cooper, the foreman who had worked for Robert for 15 years, mentioned that the entire ranch felt different lately, calmer somehow, as if the energy radiating from Thunder's pasture was affecting everything it touched. Kevin Hayes stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on safety but really to witness his old friend's ongoing metamorphosis. One evening over bourbon on Robert's porch, Kevin remarked that he had known Robert for 50 years and had never seen him sit still for more than 5 minutes. Yet now he spent hours every day simply being present with a horse. Robert had laughed and admitted that Ellen would have found the whole situation hilarious, her driven husband finally learning lessons she had tried to teach him throughout their marriage. The mention of Ellen no longer brought the sharp stab of pain it once had, but rather a bittersweet ache that felt more like remembrance than wound. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks after Eli's first visit. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, frost decorating every surface with crystalline beauty. Robert and Eli sat in their customary spot when Thunder did something unprecedented. Instead of maintaining his usual cautious distance, the stallion walked directly toward them with purpose, his ears forward, his expression curious rather than defensive. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Robert could see his reflection in the horse's dark eyes, and simply stood there, waiting. Eli's voice was barely a whisper. "He is asking you to connect. This is his invitation." Accept it slowly. Robert's hand trembled as he raised it, palm open, moving with aching slowness toward Thunder's massive gray head. Every instinct screamed at him to grab, to take control, to assert dominance now that the opportunity had finally presented itself. But he had learned enough to recognize those instincts as traps, old patterns that would shatter this fragile moment of trust. Instead, he kept his hand open and his energy soft, offering connection without demand. When his palm finally made contact with Thunder's warm velvet muzzle, Robert felt tears streaming down his face before he realized he was crying. The stallion did not pull away. He leaned into the touch, his breath huffing warm against Robert's skin, his eyes half closing in what could only be interpreted as contentment. They stayed like that for long minutes while the sun climbed higher and the valley woke around them. Eli played quiet music on his flute, a soundtrack to transformation. Jamie, who had been watching from the fence, walked over slowly and added his hand to Thunder's neck. And for the first time in years, father and son stood together in perfect harmony, united in their reverence for this moment. In the weeks that followed, Thunder's trust deepened and expanded. He began following Robert around the pasture like an enormous dog, curious about what this human was doing, seeking out scratches and companionship. Robert learned where Thunder loved to be touched, behind the ears and along the crest of his neck, and where he was still sensitive and preferred space. The idea of riding Thunder became irrelevant. Robert no longer cared about proving the stallion could be mounted or about winning the wager he had made in what felt like another lifetime. The relationship itself was the victory, the daily gift of connection with a being who had chosen to trust him despite every reason not to. Robert began making other changes in his life, recognizing that the lessons from Thunder's pasture had applications far beyond horse training. He delegated more at work, discovering that his business ran just fine without his constant micromanagement. He started saying no to deals that did not align with his values, prioritizing relationships over transactions. He reached out to old friends he had neglected during his years of empire building, rebuilding bridges he had let burn in his single-minded pursuit of success. The big stone house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home as Jamie moved back in and they started having regular dinners together, actually talking rather than just existing in parallel silence. On a cold November morning, Robert woke before dawn and drove to Eli's farm without announcement. He found the farmer in his barn, tending to chickens, and asked if he could hire him as a consultant to redesign his entire ranch operation around principles of respect and partnership rather than dominance and control. Eli had smiled and agreed, not for the money but because he saw that Robert's transformation was genuine and deserved support. Together, they began planning changes that would affect every aspect of the Thornton estate, from how horses were trained to how staff were treated to how the land itself was managed. The final piece came on a bright December afternoon when Robert stood in Thunder's pasture and asked the question that had been forming in his heart for weeks. Would you let me sit on your back? Not to prove anything, not to show anyone, just to see what it feels like to be partners in that way. Thunder stood calmly as Robert approached with a saddle pad. No bit or bridle, just soft fleece to cushion the contact. The stallion's acceptance was so complete that Robert could barely believe it was the same animal who had terrorized 24 riders months earlier. With Eli and Jamie's help, Robert eased himself onto Thunder's broad back, moving with the careful slowness that had become second nature. Thunder shifted slightly, adjusting to the weight, then began walking of his own accord, carrying Robert around the pasture in slow circuits that felt less like riding and more like dancing. From Thunder's back, the valley looked different. The mountains seemed both closer and more majestic. The ranch that Robert had built as a monument to his success appeared smaller, less important, just one small piece of a vast and beautiful landscape that cared nothing for human ambition. Robert felt Thunder's powerful muscles moving beneath him, felt the trust required for this prey animal to allow a predator species to sit in the most vulnerable position imaginable, and understood with sudden clarity that this was what Ellen had been trying to teach him all along, that the best things in life could not be taken or bought or forced. They could only be received as gifts freely given when the conditions were right. When Robert finally slid down from Thunder's back, his legs shaky and his heart full, Eli was there with his quiet smile and knowing eyes. You did it, Not the way you thought you would, but you did it. Robert shook his head. Thunder did it. I just finally learned how to listen. The story of Robert Thornton and Thunder spread throughout Montana and beyond. Not as a tale of domination, but as something rarer and more valuable. A story of transformation, of a proud man learning humility, of a terrified horse finding safety, of relationship mattering more than results. People began visiting the Thornton Ranch not to witness spectacle but to learn, and Robert found himself teaching the lessons Eli had taught him, passing forward the gift of patience and respect that had saved not just Thunder but himself. On Christmas morning, Robert stood on his porch with Jamie beside him and a phone pressed to his ear, talking to his sister whom he had not spoken to in 5 years, mending that relationship too. In the pasture, Thunder grazed peacefully, his gray coat glowing silver in the winter light. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, as they always had and always would. But in the small human dramas playing out in their shadow, something had shifted. A hard man had softened. A wild horse had chosen trust. And in that choosing, both had been set free. The winter that settled over the Flathead Valley brought with it a transformation so complete that those who had known Robert Thornton in his former life barely recognized the man he had become. Snow blanketed the mountains in thick layers of white that seemed to muffle the world, creating a hushed reverence that matched the internal changes taking place at the Thornton estate. The ranch that had once operated with military efficiency and rigid hierarchy began to breathe differently, as if the land itself had been waiting for permission to relax into something more natural and sustainable. Robert found himself waking earlier than ever before, not from anxiety or the compulsive need to check markets and emails, but from genuine eagerness to begin his days. The dawn hours he spent with Thunder had become sacred time, a meditation that set the tone for everything that followed. He would stand in the gray pre-dawn light with his coffee steaming in the cold air, watching the stallion emerge from the shelter of the cottonwoods like a ghost materializing from mist. Thunder would approach without hesitation now, lowering his great head to receive the greeting that had become their ritual. Robert's palm pressed gently to the horse's forehead, both of them breathing together in the stillness before the world demanded their attention. Eli continued to visit several times a week, though their relationship had evolved beyond teacher and student into something more like friendship between equals. They would sit for hours discussing not just horses but life itself, philosophy emerging naturally from observation. Eli spoke about his years as a veterinarian and the burnout that had nearly destroyed him, about the way modern culture taught people to see animals and nature as resources to be exploited rather than relationships to be honored. Robert shared stories from his decades in real estate, the ruthless deals and crushed competitors, the wealth accumulated at the cost of nearly everything else that mattered. Both men were healing from their pasts, using their time with Thunder as a kind of therapy neither would have sought through conventional means. Jamie had taken on more responsibility at the ranch, not because Robert demanded it but because he wanted to be part of what his father was building. Father and son worked side by side redesigning the operation from the ground up, consulting with Eli and other experts who understood regenerative agriculture and ethical animal husbandry. They reduced the number of horses they kept, focusing on quality of life rather than quantity of animals. They improved pastures, rotating grazing areas and planting native grasses that would support the ecosystem rather than depleting it. They built relationships with the horses based on trust rather than dominance, spending weeks or months gaining each animal's confidence before ever attempting to ride. The changes extended to the human workers as well. Robert called a meeting with his entire staff in early January, gathering everyone in the heated barn while snow fell softly outside. He stood before them, this man who had once ruled through intimidation and the implicit threat of his temper, and apologized. He acknowledged that he had created a workplace culture based on fear and demanded perfection without offering the support or respect his employees deserved. He announced new policies, better pay, reasonable hours, and most importantly, a voice in how the ranch operated. Some of the older hands were skeptical, having seen Robert's moods shift before, but Dale Cooper stood and vouched for the changes, explaining that this was different, that the boss had fundamentally changed and they were all seeing the evidence daily. The financial reality of Robert's transformation required adjustments. Running a ranch based on ethical principles rather than maximum efficiency meant lower profits, at least in the short term. Robert sold off several properties in his real estate portfolio, liquidating assets he had once guarded jealously, and redirected the capital toward making the ranch sustainable. He paid off debts and simplified his life, discovering that the reduction in wealth brought a corresponding increase in peace. Money, he realized with something like wonder, had been both his god and his prison, and releasing his death grip on accumulation felt like setting down a burden he had carried so long he had forgotten what it felt like to walk upright. Thunder became something of a local legend, not for being unrideable but for being the catalyst of transformation. People from across Montana began visiting the ranch, not the spectacle seekers who had come for the original wager but genuine seekers looking for wisdom about handling difficult horses or healing from their own traumas. Robert and Eli developed informal workshops, teaching the principles that had saved Thunder and, in the process, saved Robert. They emphasized observation over action, relationship over results, patience over force. Some visitors got it immediately, understanding that they were learning about far more than horse training. Others left frustrated, wanting techniques and quick fixes, unable to grasp that the work required internal transformation before external change could occur. Deputy Marshal Kevin Hayes watched his old friend's metamorphosis with a mixture of pride and amazement. One evening in late January, sitting on Robert's porch despite the cold, he remarked that in all their decades of friendship, he had never seen Robert genuinely happy until now. Robert considered this statement carefully, rolling it around in his mind like a stone polished by water. He realized Kevin was right. He had been successful, wealthy, respected, feared, admired, but never truly happy. Happiness, he had always assumed, would arrive once he achieved the next goal, closed the next deal, proved himself one more time. But happiness, he now understood, was not a destination but a state of being that arose naturally when you stopped fighting against reality and learned to work with it instead. His relationship with Jamie deepened in ways that felt miraculous given how distant they had been just months earlier. They began taking long rides together through the valley, Robert on Thunder and Jamie on a gentle mare named Willow. These rides were mostly silent, both men comfortable with quiet, but occasionally they would talk about Ellen, sharing memories and grief they had both been holding separately. Robert learned that Jamie had been terrified during his mother's illness, afraid not just of losing her but of watching his father disappear into work and anger. Jamie admitted he had considered not coming back to Montana after college, unwilling to subject himself to Robert's constant disappointment and criticism. But Ellen had asked him to give his father another chance, to remember that grief makes people behave in ways they would not otherwise choose, and Jamie had honored that request even when it cost him peace. Robert wept when Jamie told him this, great heaving sobs that came from a place so deep he had not known it existed. They were sitting on a ridge overlooking the valley, the horses grazing nearby, the winter sun painting everything in shades of blue and gold. Robert apologized for the years he had been absent even when present, for making Jamie feel like nothing he did was ever good enough, for using his son as a proxy for his own unresolved issues. Jamie accepted the apology with grace and offered his own for the ways he had judged his father without trying to understand the pain driving his behavior. They rode back to the ranch in healing silence, something fundamental having shifted between them, a wound beginning to close that had been open for far too long. The spring came late to Montana that year, winter clinging stubbornly to the high country even as the valleys began to green. Thunder shed his thick winter coat in great patches, emerging sleek and magnificent beneath the shagginess. His personality continued to blossom in the safety Robert and Eli had created. The stallion developed a playful streak, stealing hats from unwary visitors and tossing them in the air, engaging in elaborate games of chase with Jamie, nickering greetings when Robert arrived each morning. Dr. Patricia Owens, who visited regularly to monitor the horse's health, remarked that she had never seen such a complete transformation in an animal, that Thunder's stress markers had normalized completely, and his behavior suggested he was experiencing something close to joy. Robert began writing, an activity he had never considered before. He kept a journal documenting his experiences with Thunder, trying to capture the lessons he was learning and the internal shifts he was experiencing. The writing was clumsy at first, his businessman's prose stiff and formal, but gradually he found a voice that felt more authentic. He wrote about grief and pride, about Ellen and the man he had been when she was alive versus the man he had become after her death. He wrote about Thunder with a tenderness that would have embarrassed him months earlier but now felt simply honest. The journal became a space where he could be vulnerable without audience, working through decades of suppressed emotion and unexamined assumptions. Eli suggested that Robert might benefit from meeting Joseph Redfeather, the Salish elder who had taught Eli to carve flutes and listen to silence. Robert agreed with some trepidation, unsure what to expect from this meeting but trusting Eli's judgment. They drove to the Flathead Reservation on a warm April afternoon, the road winding through country that took Robert's breath away with its stark beauty. Joseph lived in a modest house surrounded by gardens that were just beginning to wake from winter dormancy. He greeted them with quiet warmth, his ancient eyes seeming to see through Robert's remaining defenses to something essential beneath. They sat together for hours, drinking tea and talking about everything except horses. Joseph told stories about his grandfather, who had lived through the establishment of the reservation and the systematic destruction of traditional Salish culture. He spoke about resilience and adaptation, about how his people had survived by remembering who they were even when the world tried to erase them. He talked about the importance of ceremony and ritual, the way human beings need practices that connect them to something larger than individual ego. Robert listened with an intensity he usually reserved for business negotiations, recognizing that he was being offered wisdom that could not be bought or taken, only received with humility. Before they left, Joseph presented Robert with a flute he had carved, a more refined instrument than the one Eli carried but made from the same principles. He explained that the flute was not a gift but a responsibility, that Robert was being entrusted with a tool for creating harmony and that he must treat it with respect. Robert accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that this exchange was significant in ways he could not fully articulate. On the drive back to Whitefish, he asked Eli what he should do with the flute, and Eli smiled and said simply to play it, to experiment and discover what music lived inside him waiting to be born. Robert practiced every evening on his porch, his playing terrible at first, producing more squeaks and gasps than actual notes. But he persisted with the same patience he had learned to apply with Thunder, understanding that mastery was not the point. The point was engagement, the willingness to be a beginner, to struggle and fail and try again without self-judgment. Gradually, he began producing simple melodies, nothing elaborate or particularly beautiful but honest expressions of his internal state. Thunder would often come to the fence when Robert played, standing and listening as if the music carried meaning beyond sound. The summer brought tourists to the valley, and with them renewed interest in the story of Robert Thornton and his impossible horse. A journalist from a national magazine arrived, wanting to write a feature about the millionaire who had transformed from ruthless businessman to horse whisperer. Robert was reluctant to participate, uncomfortable with the attention and worried that media coverage would turn his genuine transformation into another spectacle. But Jamie convinced him that sharing their story might help others who were trapped in similar patterns of pride and control, that vulnerability was a gift worth offering even when it felt risky. The resulting article was thoughtful and nuanced, capturing both Robert's former arrogance and his current humility. It included photographs of Robert with Thunder, the two of them standing together in golden evening light, the stallion's head resting on Robert's shoulder in an image of trust so complete it seemed almost impossible. The article went viral, not because of the horse training aspects but because it told a story people desperately needed to hear, that change was possible no matter how entrenched the patterns, that pride could transform into wisdom, that relationship mattered more than domination. Letters and emails flooded in from around the world. People shared their own stories of being trapped by success, of achieving everything they thought they wanted only to discover it was not what they needed. Business executives wrote about their own thunders, the relationships or values they had sacrificed in pursuit of wealth and status. Parents wrote about reconnecting with estranged children after reading the article. One letter, from a rancher in Wyoming, explained that he had been about to put down a difficult horse but decided to try patience instead, and 3 months later that horse was his best friend. Robert answered as many letters as he could, usually by hand in his increasingly comfortable handwriting, offering what wisdom he had gained and emphasizing that he was still learning, still struggling, still discovering new layers of the work. The ranch continued to evolve throughout the summer. They added educational programs for young people, teaching kids about ethical animal care and environmental stewardship. Jamie developed a particular gift for working with teenagers, helping them see that gentleness was strength rather than weakness, that patience produced better results than force. Some of the kids who came through the program were troubled, sent by parents or counselors who hoped that working with horses might reach them in ways therapy had not. Robert watched his son guide these young people with wisdom and compassion, seeing clearly the man Jamie had become despite rather than because of his parenting, and felt both regret for the years he had missed and gratitude that they had found their way back to each other. Thunder thrived in his role as teacher and healer. He seemed to understand that certain visitors needed his particular kind of medicine, approaching them with gentleness even when he maintained distance from others. Robert watched the stallion work his magic on a young veteran struggling with PTSD, saw the man's face transform as Thunder allowed himself to be touched, the simple gift of trust from one traumatized being to another, creating a bridge back to wholeness. These moments, far more than any business deal or property acquisition, filled Robert with purpose and meaning. As autumn returned to the valley and the aspens turned gold against darkening evergreens, Robert reflected on the year that had passed since Eli Brooks first drove his battered truck up the long drive to the estate. Everything had changed, not just externally but internally, in ways that felt permanent rather than temporary. He was not the same man who had stood on his porch making a bet he was certain he would win. That man had died, or at least the worst parts of him had, and what remained was softer, wiser, more connected to himself and others and the natural world he had once seen only as something to be owned and exploited. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after the original wager, Robert stood in Thunder's pasture and removed the halter the stallion wore for identification purposes. Thunder shook his head vigorously, his mane flying, then took off at a gallop across the pasture, bucking and playing like a much younger horse. Robert watched him run. This magnificent creature who had saved his life by refusing to be broken, and felt overwhelming gratitude. He had come so close to destroying something irreplaceable in his need to prove his dominance. Instead, Thunder had taught him that the greatest strength lay not in control but in surrender, not in winning but in connection, not in taking but in receiving what was freely offered. Eli joined him at the fence, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching Thunder run. Finally, Eli spoke. "You did good work. With him and with yourself." Robert shook his head. "Thunder did the work. I just finally stopped getting in his way." Eli smiled. "That is what the work is. Learning when to act and when to simply be present. You have become a good student." Jamie appeared with news that someone from the governor's office had called, wanting to discuss Robert's ranching practices as a potential model for sustainable agriculture across the state. Robert felt the old pride stirring, the desire for recognition and validation, but now he could observe it without being controlled by it. He thanked Jamie for the message and said he would think about it, that recognition was less important than the actual work, that he was content to remain small and focused rather than expanding into something that might dilute the principles they were building. As winter approached again, bringing with it the promise of snow and the crystal silence of the high country cold, Robert Thornton stood on his porch in the gathering dusk and played his flute for Thunder, who stood at the fence listening. The notes were simple and imperfect, but they carried in them everything Robert had learned about patience and humility, about loss and healing, about the long journey from pride to wisdom. The mountains absorbed his music without judgment, as they had absorbed the music and prayers of countless humans before him, as they would continue absorbing long after he was dust. And in that absorption, in the recognition of his smallness within vast systems of geology and weather and time, Robert found a peace that had eluded him throughout decades of striving. He had set out to tame a wild horse and instead had been tamed himself, broken open by grace, rebuilt into something both stronger and softer than what had come before. Thunder nickered softly in the darkness, and Robert answered, and the conversation between them continued without words, a dialogue of presence and trust that would sustain them both through whatever winters remained. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.